just so you know, I am going to record both this one and the next one, and I'll be able to make them into YouTube links. And I'll be able to send those to you. That way, folks that couldn't attend can jump on. So, well, good morning. It's kind of amazing that we're halfway through November. It feels like it was just yesterday when we met the first time back in July. But this is something BR and I have done several times in between Evidence in Action 1 and 2. It's interesting. We worked with a similar district in size, and I just think in a lot of ways as Rutherford, right around the same time in July. And it's interesting when I see some of the questions that have come forth, and BR and I were talking about this. They did their Evidence in Action 2 in October. So we actually did the days right after we left you for Foundation and Evidence in Action 1, but their time frame was a lot tighter. I think the difference, though, there was they did Evidence in Action 1 right after we did the Foundation Day. We kind of did them back to back. So they kind of got sort of that double dose where we got away from it for a month and came back together. So it's interesting how similar the questions are, how they mirror each other, but how they're just different because of the different times in between. So BR is going to jump on here in a minute. If he doesn't, he wanted to apologize. He's got some things going on at his school. He was down a couple of administrators today, but he wants to just extend his hellos, and he'll be with us as much as he can today, but certainly with us full and ready to go on Monday the 21st. So really this is the kind of the overarching question that we're always trying to ask throughout the visible learning journey is do we know now more about our learners than we did back in July or we did back in August? And I want to stress, I was just doing a Inside Series day on Monday with just one school in Toledo, Ohio, and they were developing similar to what we did, where we said, what do we want our learners to be at Riverside Elementary? And I had to push a couple of the groups that were just going, well, students. Well, students are learners, but certainly the adults are too. And so while we obviously we're focusing our time on asking students what are they learning and things like that, that matrix is also an opportunity for us to gauge, where are the adult learners. So I'm going to open up with just a couple overarching pieces, and then I just want to open it up for some questions. And for those of you that are not familiar with GoToMeeting, you have a chat function on the right side. You can send the question to everyone. You can send it just to the presenter, which is actually me. If you do that privately, not a problem. Please let me know if you want me to respond to the whole group, if you want me to respond just to you. But I really want to stress this is organic in nature, and really I want it to be as interactive as possible. And some of you might have a question that you want to wait and follow up and ask afterwards. And I just want to extend that that's the whole purpose of this, is to provide as many opportunities for any of your buildings, any of your teachers, your school teams to have an opportunity to say, here's where we are, and help us move forward and make the most, not only out of the 21st, but the time after that as well. So I think all of us as adults, when we go through the visible learning journey, we feel like, we get into the pit, and that's a good thing. And especially for the teachers, I was doing some common formative assessment work recently in a district, and it was a nice epiphany for a few teachers who said, I now maybe understand what my middle school kiddos are going through every day, because I'm struggling with being stuck and not knowing what to do, and realizing that I've got to use my peers around me. And they just basically kind of said they haven't maybe realized what a struggle that was for the kids on a daily basis. And so it's good to have that awareness of being in the pit. And especially as administrators, we're maybe getting a different lens of how we look at teaching and learning in our schools in Rutherford that the teachers deal with on a daily basis. So I want to always go back, as we've stressed kind of, I think, from day one in our visible learning journey, success criteria, and pretty simple. But I would hope by the end of this webinar, you have any of your specific questions answered, or if certainly maybe not answered by the end of this hour session, asked with the understanding that they'll be responded to and answered certainly before I would commit. If you send me anything privately before we start our business Monday morning. I do hear a few more beeps, so those of you who have joined on, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. I've kind of said a couple of times, I want to make this as interactive as possible. So when I open it up for questions, please jump in, and I would love to have some voice to voice. But if you could mute your line prior to that, just because it just helps for any background.
You might want to keep that unless you want to talk.
Just a couple overarching, kind of thoughts as we go through the visible learning journey. And as I mentioned a moment ago, I was with a school an elementary school yesterday in Toledo, Ohio, or it was Tuesday. Yeah, sometimes the days come together. And one of the teachers says, is there a video that shows how this program is implemented that shows exactly how schools do this? And that was sort of feedback for me to say, okay, um, as the teacher, they were missing something because visible learning isn't a program, and it's not something that's ever going to look the same, even in a district that's been very, I think, unified in their approach with visible learning, like Rutherford, or even in a district that's not as large as having 45 or 46 school campuses. So every one of us will become and develop a visible learning school over time. And that's one thing I really love about the work is it's very organic, and it's got the ability to have sort of a one size fits one approach. Um, and kind of a little, funny metaphor, we run that marathon one step at a time. And while it seems daunting in the beginning, I think that's why I'm really excited going into Evidence in Action 2 to prepare and build upon some of our existing professional development plans to best develop our adult learners over time so that they can then best develop our student learners. And we've certainly made headway across the board in Rutherford and many of the examples I've seen and interacted with some of the schools. So it's that kind of constant journey into where we want some of these practices to become, as we look at the visible learning matrix, systemic or at least commonplace. Certainly not going to be systemic or commonplace overnight. And that's just a good thing to remember, that this just is hard work. And this was just sort of a little way to think about it. We sort of have that concrete experience. We all came together, did the foundation day, even came back in August and did day 2. And then we had to reflect and get away from it. When teachers come to me sometimes, and especially when I'm doing common formative assessment work, and their challenge, which I understand, is, when do we move on? When do we move on when they don't all get it? Well, the nice thing to remember is no, we're never all going to get it. But what I push them on is it conceptual learning? Because, understanding math facts, understanding how the periodic table is put together and how a noble gas is formed, that's sort of procedural knowledge. Once you get it, you kind of get it. But a lot of our learning in our schools and in life is conceptual. And conceptual learning happens over time. And so when we think about developing visible learners, when we think about what an effective feedback model is in my school, that's something that we go through experience. And so also, as a footnote there, I think it's an opportunity, because I'm sure we've had some that have been fence sitters or even what I would call the doubting Thomas, because teachers are busy and they're not sure it's going to work. We often don't change belief. We change behavior, and then belief follows. And unfortunately, I would love to be able to say that's my quote, but it's really not. It's Tom Guskey has said that, and Doug Reeves and many others. And where we're at right now is moving into Evidence Action 2 is that active experimentation. So we're going to build a plan. We're going to put some things in place, very specific actions and strategies, and determine how they're working. So, and again, not a overly complicated little schematic here. It's simple, but it's not necessarily simplistic in nature. But I think this kind of guides a lot of the visible learning work. So after this slide here, I'm going to pause and just open it up for some questions. And Trey, I'm going to maybe ask you if you wouldn't mind jumping in and just sharing any thoughts and perspectives. And then I want it to be a little bit organic from here. I've got one other defined piece I was going to walk through. But prior to that, I want it to be where are schools at, where are folks at? And we budgeted 11 to 12, my time, 10 to 11, your time. Certainly we won't go over that, but we don't have to take all that time if we complete it. But where do we start? And I'm hoping that we're past that stage. But if we're coming into Evidence Action 2, and we've got some reasonable baseline evidence statements, we've got our matrix report out. The place will always be, on a consistent basis, how are we monitoring the magnitude of the impact on how the students are learning? And certainly we're going to look at any assessment data and evidence we have, but that voice evidence is really what's going to be most important. That's going to be really most powerful. So I'm going to pause now, and Trey, if you wouldn't mind jumping in and sharing any thoughts, perspectives, and then we'll kind of leave it open to some questions and just kind of see how that evolves.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, the one thing I want to point out is I know I've gotten several questions about, and I think Dave hit it great at the beginning of, what we've tried to push all the time, this is not a program. Again, it's about what do you know about your students and looking at it that way. And I know the conversations I've had with quite a few of you, whether you're looking at the type of feedback your teachers are giving or really focusing down on implementing success criteria and what does that tell us about student learning, is this is really about between now and this evidence and action day 2, kind of assessing where your building is and what you know about your kids, which I think is I want to be the continued theme is, do we know more about our students and how they are as learners, and then using this next evidence and action day to kind of make that plan and go from there. So I know some of you guys are all in different points in what you've done so far. I've seen a couple of you guys and talked to some of you guys who have done meetings and have done some trainings and have really implemented some things in your school, and some other ones haven't gone much past their leadership team. So I think it's really about looking at, okay, where are we and what's the next step for us in getting our teachers to think that way. That's really all I have, Dave. I didn't know if
Sure.
you want to open for other specific questions or.
Sure, no, Trey, thanks, and that's kind of what I really appreciate you kind of saying that. I think one of the things you hit on that just I closed my eyes and it resonated with me was it's a great opportunity for us to realize in any classroom we're going to have learners that are further ahead than others. We're going to have some schools that are further ahead than others. Also, we might have some students who seem like they're further ahead. And I'm just using the example. My first grader is really struggling with phonemic awareness. He got a 98 percentile on NWEA reading when the teacher read it to him. I'm not panicking. He can understand. To be honest, what I had to push the teacher on, he doesn't want to do his phonics because it's hard work. I mean, it's a struggle for him. But my point is even though it might seem like he's further behind in terms of his reading, he's not really as far behind. In fact, he might even be ahead of where some very fluent readers are who can't articulate what they're reading. And so it might seem like you come into evidence and action 2 with less quantitative evidence from your school gathering. You might not think you're as far ahead as some of your other peers, and actually that might not necessarily be the case. So not to feel like that there's any right or wrong of where you're at. If you feel confident that the evidence you're gathering is providing you quality inferences, well, then that's what's most important. And so one of the things we'll do on in the morning, and I think it's very powerful, is there'll be a sort of a protocol for a group sharing where you'll be in smaller groups with 5 or 6 schools together, and you'll rotate through a 8 to 10 minute protocol where you'll share not only your evidence but what inferences you made, and there'll be some sort of, for all due respect, sort of playing devil's advocate question stems from your peers, not to challenge, but to make sure that we as evaluators we seek negative evidence first, just to make sure we don't make that assumption that things are stronger than they are. It's better to measure twice and cut once. So, but no matter what, I want everyone to feel that everybody, especially as large of a district as Rutherford, we're going to have folks coming in at different levels, and we're just picking November 21st as our day to come together. Just like when we want to kind of coach teachers and students and parents, just because we gave the report card today doesn't mean your son or daughter is failing or completely has it. It was where we measured today. It's the same kind of perspective. So I kind of wanted to open up and see, are there any just overarching questions that anybody has to get started? Anyone wouldn't mind sharing? And to be honest, I don't want to put anyone necessarily on the spot, but it doesn't have to be a question. It can be, here's something I tried in my school. Here's something that we're doing. Before I move on with anything else, anybody who wouldn't mind offering that, and again, it's completely optional, but I would love to hear, and I know your peers would love to hear either a question or a comment, or here's something we're working on, here's what we thought worked, anything at all about what's happening in our schools.
Can you hear me?
I can. Who is speaking?
Oh, this is Sarah Sears from Rockville Middle.
Hey, Sarah.
Hey, I've never done one of these before. One of the things that we've noticed, we surveyed all of our student population. One of the things we're working on here is tracking student progress and having them track their own progress. But one of the things we noticed that after we did our survey, the numbers showed that 38% of teachers here have students track their progress. Or excuse me, 46% of teachers here have students track their progress, but only 38% of students know what that looks like. So I guess my question is, what can we do as far as in the building to have students know what that looks like?
And I really appreciate that. What I wouldn't mind, and Sarah, thanks for getting it kicked off. If others have questions like that, I'm going to just compile the list, and then I'll address several in a few minutes. So thank you for getting us started. I've got some thoughts to that, but I'd rather get a few more going. Anybody else that wants to kind of pyramid off that? And the reason why I like to type these, number one, is it's a nice working record, and it also makes sure that I captured what you shared. Who else? Anybody else have a question or a thought, anything at all that will keep that momentum going, and then we'll kind of respond to these. And Trey, what I'll do is I'll respond verbally with some examples, but any of the questions that come up with either webinar, I'll respond in writing or with maybe just a short slide deck, even recorded webinar, so everybody who might not even be on this will be able to have a chance to hear them and see the responses.
Dave, I'm going to throw in a question I've gotten. I've tried to clarify over email, but and this is a question, and again, I think it goes more to making sure we're clear. I know I've had several schools ask me, okay, what exactly are you wanting us to bring on the 21st? And so maybe if you could just clarify that one more time for those schools as well.
Absolutely. That was something that I definitely was going to hit, and I'll make sure that I kind of do that early as well as kind of follow up with an email. I'm going to respond to Sarah's question. It's going to take me just a second to pull up a couple examples, but when I was working back, as I mentioned at the start of the webinar, with the district in California, and one of the administrators said they had, for example, this is not an exact quote, but it was pretty close. They had about 70% of their students could respond to what they were learning. 64% could respond to how they would demonstrate what they've learned, but only about 32% could respond to what their next learning steps were. And so one of my comments was that it's a big gap between that about 86% students could tell you what they were learning, but very few could respond in terms of what their next learning step was. That will never be equal. If you're monitoring learning, for example, in this one with Sarah, where we say 46% of the teachers are having the students track their data, but we don't have that exact number of in all those classes students understanding. If it's 100% and it's a match, that would raise my red flag. I go, okay, even though students are monitoring their data, is it possible that the rigor level is lower? So just as kind of a footnote, we're never going to have that correlation, but where can we get a little bit closer and tighter and better with that, so that way it is a smaller gap? And I'm going to show a couple authentic examples as well. I'm just moving just a few things around just to get them kind of lined up on the slides. But the first thought I had was, when we think about when we did the activity, and I think let's click on it. Sorry guys, I'm moving slides around and their hand got stuck. There we go. I'll just start with this one. But when we did this activity, or this example, and putting something similar to this, and I've got multiple examples of how teachers have adapted these. But when students are tracking their data, to have them, one of the things John Hattie would say is we need to be cautious of having students set their own goals without some monitoring. Students will often set safe targets. As students are setting and tracking their goals, to have that supplementary piece in there to go, is what you're doing to get to your goal, is it easy? Do you have no idea if what you're doing is working? Is it hard? Is it something that you need to work on? And so that there's some type of element within there. So when students are tracking their data, they're able to monitor which strategies are actually working the best. And so I think that's that key question in the middle: where am I going? How am I going? And where to next? The other thing that I thought of was, here we go, right here, is thinking of the Common Core standards. And again, they're not perfect, and I kind of cringe whenever I see some comments that attack them, or it's a political piece or anything else. That they're just words on paper. And what hurt the Common Core was the testing, and Pearson and some other organizations that got involved. But if we just take the language arts Common Core standards, and one thing that is so powerful in them, and the math are similar, but the language arts are so well threaded and scaffolded that now, as students are tracking their data, okay, I know let's say I'm in 8th grade, and my job is to code accurately. I can't quote accurately, but I could still ask and answer questions. Or I can quote accurately with a grade level text that's a little bit lower than where I should be in terms of my Lexile level. So I can do it, but I got to do it with a little bit less challenging text. So then, and that's where as the teacher and in the PLC setting, and this was something I really think is important for us to talk about as we go into our time together on the 21st, is how can we plan to provide the right amount of support, because teacher learning and teacher sharing of ideas and teachers developing examples can happen in that PLC setting. And really that's where they will learn the most. At the same time, we have to have enough accountability to where, okay, in the next 6 PLC meetings, what are your 3 or 4 actions that you hope to accomplish? Now, what are you going to do on this day? So that way they might say, what we want to do is have Sarah and Trey and Dave come together, and we're going to bring some grade level texts that are related to the standard. And Trey's actually pretty good at bringing some ones that are a little bit higher Lexile level, or they're qualitatively more challenging. And Dave's got some that are they're a little bit below grade level, but they would really help us determine if the students in just this example could quote accurately. So now it's not just that the students are tracking their own data or the teachers are having them do that. There's a little bit more intentionality with how we're having them do that. And I know what the teachers might initially say is, gosh, that seems like it's hard work. Initially it might be, but we might create so much more authentic ownership of not only students tracking their data, knowing why they're tracking it, and becoming so much more of their own teacher that I will have to give less support over time to some, because they're able to monitor, I'm climbing this ladder and now I'm getting ready to do it with a different kind of text. So thoughts to that. And then just as a footnote, to me this also ties in where, and my standing joke when I'm working with any teachers around grading is when students go home and their parents say, how did you get a C? Most students say, I don't know. And then my response is, well, they're not lying. And so as they're tracking their data, the reason why I don't have a B plus or an A is because I can't do that yet. I haven't demonstrated enough in my work, my lessons, and my activities, the work I'm handing in. That's why. And certainly I can add some concrete elements to that, where how we accurately weight certain assignments and tasks with points and all that. So it can really actually be a lot more seamless for teachers. But I really appreciate the question, because I think this is a great place to start with Sarah's question, where they're teachers helping students track their progress, but how do we monitor that they know what they're doing? And if out of your 46%, every one of the students was understanding it, or they responded to the question correctly, I would be cautious there. So thoughts to that, Sarah, but anybody else around, because I'm sure this is a question that others might have, but just those 2 kind of examples, one using the very concrete element of the standard and measuring with that, as well as sort of that 4-box concept where we're asking students, as you're working towards your goal, is it easy? Is it hard? Is it too challenging? Or you feel like you're proud of where you're going in that progress? So thoughts to that from Sarah or anybody else who wouldn't mind chiming in if they have a thought to that or anything that's similar to pyramids off.
I mean, I never thought about the fact that you wouldn't want 100% of students doing that. That does make more sense now. I just never thought about it like that.
Well, and it's that fine line, and when I was an administrator and we had our school improvement data points that we would monitor, one of them was our IEP goals. And if students were meeting, and we would monitor it quarterly, because we had a very large high school, very large middle school when I was there, and we would monitor quarterly as that data point. And we would do the annual case reviews on the student's birthday. It was something that I put in place because we had a large number of special ed students, and we were always doing it from March and April. So I said, no, let's do it on the student's birthday. That will spread it out. Anyway, the point I'm making, what we determined was that if more than 90% of the students were meeting their IEP goals, we wanted to reevaluate. And it wasn't that we didn't think or believe or want our special education students to achieve, but you could reach your goal that was lower than you should have reached. And you could not reach your goal, but you actually exceeded your potential. And so it's that fine line, which it makes it messy. It makes it where, as teachers and educators, it'd be nice to keep it nice with a bow tie and tight and pretty. I'm going to stay on this point just for a moment. I don't know if I shared this when I was with you, because I actually did this webinar the day before I came, and VR and I came back in August. But this is in Valley View School District, and one I've mentioned a lot. But we did this as a poll on the webinar, but 3 schools, and building 1, building 2, building 3. So you see the 3 questions that were asked. What are you learning? How will you know where you've learned it? And then what is your next learning step? So out of these 3 schools, we're just going to do this as a little group activity. Which do you think of these 3 schools had the highest park results, and which one had the lowest park results? I'll leave it up for just a moment. Kind of be the only quiz activity we'll do. But do you see numbers that say, what are you learning? How will you know if you've learned it? And where to next? Which school do you think had the highest and lowest park results out of this group of 3? Anybody want to take a stab or a guess at which one they thought had the highest?
I'll do it, Bill. I mean, yeah, I'll jump in there. My initial thought was, well, probably building 1 because 41% could say where to next. But then my second thought was what you just said. If 100% of the students can articulate what are we learning, are we setting it too low or we're not rigorous enough? And so then I thought probably building 2 or 3.
Yeah, it was actually 3. And actually 3 had the highest results in the district, and building 1 had the lowest results. And so it's that fine line. When you look at building 3, that really kind of makes sense. Not only did a lot of them know what they were learning, there was a nice strong correlation to how they would know where they have learned it. Now, where to next? We would expect, with rare exception, there to be a gap there, because, and that's the real hard work, where students know, okay, not only do I know when I've learned it, I know what my next learning step is. That means I know what the next unit, the next lesson, the next set of success criteria, all of those things. With that first school, what they found was there was just a low level of rigor. Now, the nice thing is that's a school that knows where to jump in. I mean, I would rather, have a lot of students know what they're learning and know where they've learned it, and we can increase the rigor level. At least we're starting there. But that's, back to Sarah's point, is we're monitoring this, and the teachers that are having students track their data, I think that's that good reminder. And again, that third point, that's really that next level. That's why a lot of the common formative assessment work came in. And I will just share, this was their district clarity report 612, and you see the number of students surveyed, and this was on a large scale 2-week walkthrough. These were their middle schools and high schools, and at the secondary level, the middle school, and I think that's where they've actually made the most gains, and to be honest, it's where their park results have really outshined the rest of the county, and very diverse, very, a lot of the common everyday challenges that you would see in what I would call an urban fringe district. But at the middle school level, what's a nice feather in the cap is that the gap is between 70 and 90%, which is not a large gap when you think about 6 very comprehensive middle schools in a large district, about half the size of Rutherford. At the elementary level, and what you see here over on the right-hand side is the school I just mentioned a minute ago, that had 100%, but as low as 28. So that's where they're having to dig in just a little bit more. And in the elementary teacher's defense, in all honesty, it's self-contained, K-5. Not that it's easy at the middle school level, but if I'm creating success criteria for one course, my English 9 or my English 7, the elementary level, I'm creating success criteria for math and English and maybe some science and everything else. Certainly it takes a little bit more time. But they really can, with a few exceptions, see a very, very strong correlation between high levels of teacher clarity and understanding. And here I've just listed their 2015 because their 2016s weren't available at the time of the webinar, nice and pretty, but they had some very similar results as well. And their high school, RHS, which is Romeoville High School, a few years ago they were 18th out of 20 in the county for the Illinois State Assessment. They were second in the county in park results. And so not only has the assessment gotten rigorous, they've really made some jumps. And so, again, I'm only sharing that, and certainly there's more involved, but they can really directly relate to that teacher clarity piece. So any other big questions, and then I'll go back to Trey's question and really be very clear about what we need to bring and kind of highlight where we're at with going into the 21st. But I wanted to just double check if anybody else had a thought or a question, and it doesn't have to be very specific about your school. It can be a question about what I just shared, but anyone else want to offer a thought to something that I've shared or something that's going on in your building? I gave it the standard 5-second wait time. So I'll go ahead and move on and just kind of highlight going into the 21st. And this is where, as I mentioned at the start of the webinar, anybody that has an additional question that you want to check in with me after, or have a private phone call, or even a private webinar with your school team, I am more than happy to do that. We've got just under 2 weeks, but what evidence have we gathered? Specifically to that visible learner strand, whether it's the focus groups, the interviews. If you've done any video diaries, I will highly recommend them. And the video diaries, it's like pictures of your children this fall with the leaves around them. They're amazing now, but in 10 years, they're priceless. The video diaries that you might gather now for students that you're going to be able to see in 2 or 3 years, you could pop in a student 3 years from now and show them before and after, or even in 1 year, and you will have, I've seen it happen in large staffs going, that's the same kiddo? Yeah, and guess what? His parents didn't change, his socioeconomic status didn't change, the teaching practices changed, what we focused on changed. Any walkthroughs, or if you did any of the effect size data, and really that was something that I think we kind of didn't discourage, but it really isn't in place yet with our assessment system. So really it's those first 4 points. And this is what we'll do when we come together on Monday the 21st. We'll bring our baseline evidence statements and we'll walk us through a few of those, which is really the only thing we have to bring is our baseline evidence statements and our completed report from the visible learning matrix. What we will work on then is developing our aspiration statements. And just as a footnote, those are similar to mission statements, but the reason why they're different is I aspire to be that, where my mission is what guides me. I aspire to be the best dad in the world, and have my kids say when they're older, you know what, my dad gave me the right tools. Well, if that's what I aspire to do, then I got to check on a consistent basis, is that happening? We'll then determine our focus areas, which I'm guessing will be around probably 2 places. It will be around, 3, developing students as a visible learner, and within that, success criteria into feedback. I think with rare exception, that's where we kind of guided most groups. I don't think there'll be many derivatives of that. I'm going to highlight here in just a couple of minutes, is there some knowledge and practices that need to be put in place, meaning there are some things that we as leaders and our teachers need to learn and know more about. And then what practices need to become more routine? And I really stress that word routine. There's some things that we do every day. We wash our hands before we make food in the cafeteria. We're always going to post the success criteria target in the classroom. The routine is we're going to monitor more often than not that it's of quality. The routine is I'm going to make sure 3 times a week I'm getting into a classroom twice within the same week. And, I was talking with an administrator from another district, and that was kind of his epiphany, that he tried to hit every classroom over the course of 3 or 4 weeks, but he never saw the same classroom twice in a week or twice in a period of time to see how did the teacher build off of that. We'll set some very measurable targets. So if you've gathered baseline evidence, such as, like you mentioned, 46% of our teachers in Sarah's school are tracking, having students track their data, but maybe only 60% of the students understand why. By February, I would want 70% of my teachers to help students track data, and at least 50% of the students understand that. So we'll set some measurable targets. Then we'll say, here are my defined actions and my teachers' defined actions, and then set up a period of time for monitoring. One of the things I want to share is when I used to work at the Leadership and Learning Center, and Ray Smith, who's a visible learning consultant, and Dr. Stephen White and a few others, we did just a large scale, we called it PIM. It was stood for Planning, Implementation, and Monitoring, and we were examining school improvement plans and then looking at student achievement and determining what were the criteria and factors that were within the school improvement planning process having the greatest impact. And the number one indicator was specific dates for monitoring evidence. And we're going to monitor student voice evidence the second Tuesday of every month at our leadership meeting. If we just said January, we just said third quarter, we just said spring, it's too vague. We really need to define specific dates and weeks when we're going to monitor. And I want us to kind of think about, we're all coming together on the 21st, so we're coming together on this webinar 10, 12 days before. We're going to say we're going to monitor our student voice data, for example, February 1st. Well, we should have a check-in right after Martin Luther King Day to say, hey, that's the day that we need to make sure, are we ready for that? Because that's the day we got to come with our pieces. So I'm going to walk through a couple example baseline evidence statements, pause and kind of gather some thoughts, and then go for that last piece if no questions arise. Here's an example of that I worked with a school that I just did a cut and paste for this quick webinar. For the most part, students do not feel that our school values their input or that they're allowed to learn from their mistakes. That was a generalized statement, but it's backed up with, I'm sorry, I didn't have it on this one. It was backed up with I didn't put it on the slide, during focus group interviews, most students felt like they only returned an assignment once. Here's an example that's got a little bit more qualitative and quantitative elements. Teacher clarity is sporadic. Some teachers write learning intentions and success criteria, but students have not made the connection to their work. Sir, I think yours was very similar. We could say teachers, some teachers or half of our teachers in our school are investing time in helping students track data. Our students are yet, for the most part, making a connection because only 36% of them were able to do that. What I'm getting at is we can make sort of this qualitative statement, but we want to be able to back up some with the quantitative. And so in this particular school, in 48 of 61 visits, students did not make the connection between the success criteria and their current learning task. When we asked them, what are you learning? They said, I'm doing my worksheet. I'm completing my graphic organizer. They didn't connect it to, no, you're actually writing an argumentative essay or you're writing your science lab up. What was interesting, if we stopped there, and this particular school initially did, they might say, you know what, we've really got to continue as a whole on success criteria. When they dug into it and they went back, and this is where, if you haven't done this yet, it's not something that you need to overreact to, but if you're still gathering evidence, what's enough disaggregation that you would want to do? When you're asking students, do you want to monitor it by, I do want to check the difference between 6th, 7th, or 8th grade. I don't know if it was English, math, science, or social studies. One of the schools that I was recently working with, and this is something I think is something I hadn't thought of, but it's really important. They were monitoring, was it the beginning of the day or the end of the day? Because for a middle or high school student, by the time they get to their last class of the day, they've had 7. And so we might have to be more intentional later in the day with success criteria. But either way, in this example, in science, success criteria is embedded. Students are making that connection. And so part of their plan was to say, we're going to continue working with success criteria at our staff meetings and early releases. And 2 of the next 4 sessions, the science teachers are going to lead it. So you might not be at this complete level of specificity, but I want to stress a balance of the qualitative, but you could back it up then with the quantitative in a sense. And if you haven't had a chance, and Trey, I don't know if I had sent the little 4-pager out because, and I'm happy to do it right after, but there's really, really quality out of any of the manuals. To me, the Evidence in Action 1 and 2 have some really good case study examples. I'm going to provide a couple others that are authentic that you can see what other schools have done. But we would want to come with, like what we see here, these types of baseline evidence statements. If we walk in with these, in addition to our Visible Learning Matrix report, not only is that all we need to bring for the day, I think it's going to empower each team to be able to develop a deeper understanding of process, but there's going to be a lot more planning and work time. But the ability to walk out with a quality product, and no one's going to be completely finished, will really be based on how much quality evidence we're bringing. So as a footnote, I want to get quiet. For any of the schools that feel like they haven't gathered enough evidence, it's more important that you gather quality. So it's not about quantity, but you would say, I feel real good about that 2 or 3 questions that I've asked every student in the last 10 days in every classroom, and I can at least start there as opposed to making multiple baseline evidence statements, if that makes sense. So I want to pause and check for understanding and take any questions, because really that is the big kind of takeaway I wanted to make sure everybody had above all else during this webinar is that we walk in with as close as we can with our quality baseline evidence statement. So thoughts, questions, anything at all that anybody wants to ask about that or where they're at or just anything at all. I want to just hear a voice other than mine for the next minute or so. So anybody have a thought with that? Got a pretty quiet group there today, Trey. I don't know if they're just overwhelmed by the quality examples, or Dave's just guiding them, or we're just tired on a Thursday. So I don't want to push anybody to share, but I also I know sometimes I talk fast and there's a lot there and you have to reflect. So I want to give just a couple of minutes if anybody needs to just think about it.
Let me jump in there, and again, based on some of the questions I've gotten from either RTI coaches or principals, I think that really cleared up one of the major things is, wanting to have what they need to make that plan. And so I think you've done a good point of, yeah, at the minimum you have this generic statement, but anytime we can back that up with that quantitative data, it's going to make that more rich. But it's really about assessing where our schools are so we can go from there. And again, based on what I've seen from the schools that have jumped into it, I think we're going to have some schools with some good baseline evidence statements.
And as a footnote, if anybody is interested in sending me them ahead of time for any thoughts or feedback, I'd be more than happy to provide that. And to be honest, is what I did with another group, and there was a few that I said I'm not just going to offer feedback just for the sake of offering it. I think you have it. It's not that I'm saying with my fingers. We talked about it. Great job. But if anybody wants me to give them a once over or BR between now and the next couple of days, so you have another week. And one of the things that, as I mentioned at the start of the webinar, it shouldn't be that because we came on 11/21, that's why they're called baseline. So to me, every school or every EIA too, with rare exception, there's a couple of schools that kind of start and draft their plan, but one of their actions is to continue gathering some of that data for another couple of weeks because they've got a different perspective now and they don't feel comfortable enough to put a plan in place. And to me, what's nice about that is with rare exception, how much adjustment in professional development would any school do in December? We might throw a piece in here or there, but December will still be a nice month to continue to gather evidence, but January is going to be a perfect time to hit the ground running with some of our action plans. One question I want to ask them. Oh, here's a thought.
I have a question. Can you hear me okay?
Very well.
Okay, so when you were just mentioning about the aspiration statements, one of the things that you said was how we can then measure that as kind of saying if we're at 50% here, then by February or spring or whatever the date is, we want to be at 75%. So if we're coming in with our evidence statements, like these are little general, like this first one that's on the screen where it's talking about we just know that's not common in our school. Would it benefit us to already have that broken down and kind of have a percentage, like we videoed students and this percentage of students said, their responses were more dealing with behavioral characteristics and instead of learning characteristics? Like, would we be kind of a step ahead if we already kind of have got a percentage of our statements? Does that make sense?
It does, absolutely. I would say that the worst case scenario is you have more detail in your statements that we have to kind of combine some of them. But you just really nailed something. I think that adds that element of qualitative. Yeah, they could respond, but not only most of the time I could actually say 17 out of 23 students really went to the compliance-based, or when they talked about feedback, they thought it was about a grade, or any of those additional pieces, I think, are where, to me, without those, I think we're always not shooting in the dark, but I think that provides even more clarity of a focus to define the root, not root cause, but maybe root path to make some adjustments. And let me pyramid, and I'm sorry, who shared just a second ago? Sarah, was that?
It's Kelly Jones.
Kelly?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. So one of the things we will, and it pyramids off right off what you mentioned, was how will we get from point A to point B? Well, the first thing is we'll have to think about what knowledge will each of these groups need, and we'll start with ourselves. We'll start with the leaders, and when I say leaders, the teacher leaders that are in the groups, they fall in that category. Well, from there, then we're going to think about what knowledge might our teachers need, what knowledge might our students need, and certainly our families. But it really kind of starts with us. But then what practices need to become routine? So, for example, with what you shared with your students, well, students on a consistent basis need to, more often than not just try to complete the assignment, but deliberately practice and do it well. I don't want my student just to hand it in. I want them to hand it in with quality. If I want the student to do it, maybe as a teacher, this is a just quick example that I've used a lot. Far too often at any level, but I'm going to use any subject, but I'm going to use math. We have students caught up in thinking it's about getting them all done. So my kiddo's out there shooting baskets. He knows every night he can't come in until he hits 5 free throws in a row. You got to hit 5 in a row at the end. Every once in a while I give him a pass. But so I know that I have met my target today in math when I can do with my fingers 7 of these problems correctly. There might be 15. Now I've empowered the student more to know when he has learned it, and I've even allowed him or her to think the goal of getting it done right is actually less work. So with your example with that compliance base, that's where we can maybe say, okay, if we want the students to do that, well, then we've got to work with our teachers, which means we've got to back up to ourselves. So long-winded answer to a very good question. The more qualitative evidence in terms of how the responses were geared might help me as sort of the diagnosis. Okay, now I know where to start. And if that was just one that I've been hitting a lot, and I really appreciated you sharing that, because the more detail, the better. Other thoughts with that? And again, Trey, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I know you get a chance to hear a lot of different schools, and any of the examples that were just shared, like what Kelly? Just want to make sure. Kelly, was that you that just shared?
That's correct.
Okay. Like Kelly just shared, you might hear some as you're doing building walkthroughs or meetings. Any other thoughts to what she shared? Because I would imagine you might see more just because of where you're at and your level, yourself and Kathy.
No, again, I'll kind of back up what Kelly said. I think the principals and the coaches I've talked to, a lot of you are doing surveys of students, or I know several of you are going into classrooms and asking just, we're going to ask 3 kids in every class that we go in, what are you learning and how will you know if they've learned it? And, I think the qualitative data is great, but the quantitative data really, it's different to say, most of our kids could do it, and then 60% of our kids could do it, because that's when we can build that goal, like you said, Dave. But I feel like a lot of you guys have created that quantitative data and can bring that with you.
Yeah, and just as a footnote to that, and it goes back to what I responded to with Sarah's question, and what I don't want is for any of the groups or any of the, there's always one more, we can always dig deeper. We can always dig into one more question or one more piece or one more anything. But thinking about both Sarah and Kelly's questions and thoughts, asking students if they're being challenged. And so again, that 4 square red box is just a great eye-opener for teachers to say, oh, yeah, maybe the challenge isn't as much there. So if there's a way to embed, that question, was it easy? Was it hard? Was it, why? And I think at the PLC level, one of the things I've been really pushing, because, footnote, the L has always stood for the adult learning. And sometimes there's a time to look at data and common assessment evidence and things like that, but sometimes it's digging into, okay, we're about to put this strategy in place. What will be the evidence that the students are getting it? And so we'll design our exit ticket question or questions, but the teachers don't either take the time or have the time, or they don't realize the importance of, okay, what should we look for in those exit tickets? We should see them making that connection between the dependent and independent variable. We should start to have them more often than not start to argue about this point. And so what we were just literally on Tuesday, we were talking about, we can create really quality exit tickets. Why don't we also use those as the entrance tickets for our students? And so what I'm getting at is sometimes students, well, we didn't learn anything today. Okay, wait a minute. Here was your entrance ticket. Here was your exit ticket. Garbage. Look what you changed. Or if all the students in my class went from not knowing it to getting it at the end, that tells me one of two things. I really taught the heck out of it, and they're ready to go tomorrow. It was a little bit easy, but it's given me that evidence around their level of challenge. And so I think that's where we can empower our teachers at the PLC level to not feel overwhelmed with everything they could do, but here's some nuggets that will drive your teaching over the course of one day to the next to the next. And so, just another thought as we think about success criteria, and I've seen this come up lately, and it's something that's good feedback for me. To remind our teachers, rarely would you ever have success criteria for just one day? Because what if the student's absent? Or if they're like my son, he could be physically present, but he's still absent. And so sometimes our success criteria last over the course of a couple of days because we're working on something bigger and long term. And then the faster students are reaching the criteria, it tells me they're ready to move on, or maybe the challenge wasn't enough. And it's always that slippery slope. There's always going to be that battle to constantly ask better questions. But just from what Sarah and Kelly shared, I would imagine others would have had some of the same thoughts. If we're thinking around this level, not only do I believe we're going to be ready for the 21st, but I think the efforts and work we're putting in, we're going to continue to see even more over time as we move forward. So it was really all I kind of had in terms of content. We're almost at an hour, but in terms of, like you asked, Trey, what do we need to walk into on the 21st? 1 to 2 to 3 at the most baseline evidence statements, and as much as we could be qualitative and quantitative, and our visible learning matrix report printed out. If we have those ready, there's no doubt in my mind with the group that we've worked with before and the culture in Rutherford to want to work and learn. And this day, so much more than the other two combined, is going to be much more teams working, facilitation, and less of BR and Dave presenting. More of you sharing with your peers with some structures in place to ask questions of each other. So I think that the learning will probably take place even more, but then also have a chance to walk out with that start of a draft product or continuing on with your professional development plans. So are there any other thoughts or questions or anything for the good of the order? Because if everybody feels comfortable, I think this would kind of hopefully get us moving, but that's why I want anyone who feels like you want to send a question early, or if you want to send any of your baseline evidence and anything at all between now and, right up until, Monday the 21st, do not hesitate to send that. And if it comes to me, I'll shoot it over to BR as well. I didn't include his email on this, but I probably talk 2 or 3 times a week. So. Chris, could I just check, what does 6 plus mean? It was just something that came up in the chat. So, Trey, did you have anything else for the good of the order?
I don't. I hope everyone's clear. If you have questions, let me know. But I hope you I want to thank Dave for taking the time to just touch base with all of us to answer questions you may have and hopefully provide more clarity about what's coming up. And excited about the work we're doing. And Dave, thank you for that.
Pleasure is all mine. Trey, I will send you a YouTube link to this one, and then certainly we'll touch base again with the next group, I believe, at 3 Central. So
that's great.
Thoughts or questions, send them, and we'll see everybody in 10 days.